So when it comes to describing box, it's easy to go on a deep monologue with it because box is basically the most technologically advanced aspect of boxcutter, at least in my opinion. So whenever you first install boxcutter and you begin it by clicking on the tool in the T panel, you'll probably be in cut and you'll be inside of box. So a few things to keep in mind with box is the top bar is filled with information in order to give you the most awareness about your experience. So we can see off the bat that we are oriented to the object, which means that if we draw with our mouse over the mesh, we're going to orient to the surface. And if we draw with our mouse over off of the mesh, we are going to draw basically a view align cut. But because we're in perspective mode, that means that whenever I perform this extrusion, it's not going to go as desired. Keep in mind that when I drew it, I was actually obscuring this whole top area of the cube. But because I drew it in perspective, it's going to shrink as it goes into the distance, which is something that we're perpetually debating on how to solve. But it's easier to actually work in orthographic whenever you're drawing off of the mesh because it just calculates a lot easier and your life will be a lot longer just working that way. However, whenever you're working in perspective, that's also understandable whenever you're needing to draw on the surface and do things like that, but just know that it will affect your experience with view align. So boxcutter is a conglomerate of a multitude of modes. In fact, you see me drawing a box and then I press W to change it to wedge. That's really all it takes. If you're drawing a box and you want it to be a wedge, just press W. If you want it to flip, press W again. If you don't want it to be a wedge, press W again. So we've tried to make that as straightforward as possible. In a previous video, we discussed the essentialness of the Control T little mini helper. So if we press Control T, you see that we're able to taper this object. And let's say that we don't want to taper anymore. So normally you would press Shift T in order to go back into taper. We'll press T to turn solidification back off. But we see that in order to remove taper, we would need to bring it back to the main shape. So for dealing with something like that, I would actually recommend pressing Control D and just changing your taper amount back to 1, and then basically we have removed taper. Another thing new to this version is the dots and their improvement. So you've always been able to drag the dots in order to perform a bevel. However, now you're able to shift drag the blue dot in order to perform a solidification. So if you're just needing to perform a solidification and be done, you're able to do that very quickly on the fly. In fact, I'll press W to remove wedge a couple of times. And the other thing I want to show is that if you shift drag what we call the offset dot, which is the secondary dot, this dot will actually perform a taper. So it's actually very easy for you to draw a shape and get in here, pause it, shift drag a dot in order to perform a taper without having to press any hotkeys. And that's always the goal, is to try to make things easier while we're still figuring out things and laying down the core system of what we want boxcutter to be. But for the most part, we try our best to make sure that everything remains undisturbed. But if you look over these cuts, these are all made with box, but they're all different types of cuts. And so in addition to drawing with box, there's always a quick toggle on the side of all shapes in order to toggle it into a secondary behavior. And when it comes to box, that alternative behavior is line box, and this will let you draw a line and then turn it into a box, which is just a freer way of working with box whenever it comes to dealing with the restrictions of just drawing it inside the typical box format. And so I look forward to showing some of the creative uses that is the reason of this tool's existence as time goes on. However, just to show it in action, I'm just drawing lines at whatever angle and then turning them into boxes, even though I could easily be doing box for this. But if I were to want to draw it at an angle like you're seeing here, that would be a little more difficult. If we were to change it back to box and try drawing that and rotating it, we would have to tab it and then press R and rotate it, and then we're able to get it to that angle similar, versus just turning on line box and just drawing a line and turning it into a box. So continuing on, the next thing I want to talk about is the set origin. So we also want to turn off line box. So we're just going to draw a box, press tab, and at this moment we're going to press S. And you see that as we're scaling it, the object is able to sink underneath the surface. And this is actually undesirable behavior. So what we'll do is scale it back and pause it. And if we look at our origins, we see that our origin is set to the bounding box center. So that means if we look at it from the side, our origin is precisely in the center of the volume of this box. And that's actually good in some cases, but not good in all cases. So to show another example of why you would change your origin, let's actually change it to the center of the original draw. So that means basically the origin is almost equivalently where the center of this dot is. So that means if we press S, we see that it's scaling down, but it's not actually going underneath the surface. And because we scaled this a couple of times, it's not going to work out. So we'll draw a new box just to show it in action. And now you see that I'm able to scale it without any sort of regard for it missing the surface and actually sinking inside, which can be an undesirable result. So let's go ahead and right click and cancel that. And there's other origins as well, like there's one here that will set your origin to the initial mouse position, which means that if we press S, it actually will start from the very first click of drawing the box, which is another way to approach draw origins inside of boxcutter. Let's go ahead and change it to this one, which is the active element. This means that the pivot point is now the origin point of the active element that we're drawing on. So that means if I scale it down, it's going to begin scaling towards the object center. And you can see that here. Sometimes there may be a case where you would want to scale things out based on the object center of the object that you're manipulating, but it is one of the rare used object center origin options inside of boxcutter. Keep in mind that these same options that we're talking about here can also be accessed inside the DPI right here, where you can go in, or not there, my mistake. You can actually change these options right here inside of the DPI menu. So just know that these options are everywhere. In fact, we can bring up in the in panel and we look over here and we also see that we have, where is it at? Set origin. We have our set origin options located in the in panel. So the next thing I want to talk about is the operation. So there's a lot of operations you can start with. However, the most important ones are the ones located on the right side. So just starting out, we'll talk about bevel. If you have bevel on as a start modifier, that means every box you draw is going to have bevel on as a modifier. And so you can actually see every cut just being more rounded because there's a bevel happening on all the corners. And this can be an interesting way to get some really detailed sloped cuts very quickly. In addition to bevel being able to bevel like you see here, you can also press Q, which will activate basically Q bevel, and that will round the corners out at the bottom in case you want something a little more sloped as you're cutting into the surface. So here we are repeating that same bevel, and it repeats the same settings as before. If we want to get rid of that slope and go back to cutting a traditional style bevel, we can just press B to go into bevel, press Q to turn it off, and then just click to apply, and the next cut will be reflective of us making such a change. So just know that a lot has been done under the hood to make boxcutter remember all your settings on the fly whenever you're jumping between your various operations. However, we do still have plans for adding support for using multiple start operations at the same time, but we'll be talking more about that later. The next one I want to talk about is Solidify. If you have Solidify on, that means that whenever you draw, it will have a line around it, which indicates that it is a solidified shape, similar to if you just made a cube and put a Solidify modifier on it. Here I switched over to line box, which also inherits the same start operation settings as we were discussing with box, because line box is pretty much just an offshoot. The next one we'll talk about is array. So notice that the moment that I go to array, there's options for count and axis, which you can change if you need to. However, I find myself actually changing these on the fly if I need to, just dynamically. So to make this a little faster, we'll press Ctrl A and make the geometry real just to apply everything. And then we'll perform our cut, and then to adjust our array, we'll press V and then roll the wheel. So let's say that your array is just out of control. There's the hotkey of Shift R that will reset the rotation. And then if you press R, you can always rotate it to a different position as well. However, if we press V to go back into this, you see that the moment that I move it across the line, it just jumps to the other side without penetrating inside of it, which is another behavior that we took special consideration for. During the modal of this array, which I accessed by pressing V, I can also press X in order to change the axis if I need to be X or Y. And then if I need to reset the distance, that of course is Shift R. So we will just click and apply. And then notice that even though I applied this, the next cut still starts off using array because that's what it's set up to in the start operations in the top bar. So having awareness of what's going on up here and what you set up is important to, maintaining a grip on your box cutter experience. This area got a little bit tricky. I'm assuming this is because of the orientation choosing longest edge instead of local, but I was planning on getting to that later. So continuing on, here we are just drawing a cut, but we wish it would actually align to the nearest edge. So let's actually give that a try. We changed this to nearest edge, did not work. Let's actually change it to longest edge, and we see that it still actually did not work. If I were to actually want to solve this, I would just go in edit mode, select this edge, press Alt W, and while I'm in edit mode, let's set our start operation, and we will just begin drawing oriented to that line. However, this is a lot of work just to get this particular cut in this area compared to what I was planning. Another way that we could have easily have dealt with this would have been using our old buddy line box, which now utilizes local axes. And we of course want to space that out. I'm not sure what I was looking at there, but we'll be checking into that. And we see that we're able to just draw a line, and it automatically takes the axial change into consideration, just allowing us to draw arrayed objects very quickly, no matter the angle. In fact, right here I want to hold control just to draw free. We bring it in and we're able to get this cut oriented. The next modifier I want to talk about is mirror. We'll delete this cube and bring in another one, and let's look at this from the front. So the thing about mirror is that whenever you activate mirror, your cuts will now take place using the local symmetry of the object that's selected. We can get out of line box for this, and let's just go through and perform our cuts. In fact, I will take a moment and press Y to get an extraction. Let's try it again. We'll draw a box, get our extraction, and it doesn't make it over to custom cutter, and it doesn't make the extraction happen, which is also an anomaly that I feel I'll be needing to check into. So let's jump back down to box, and now we see that we have our custom cutter. But let's just jump back into mirror and begin making. In fact, as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about how the code could possibly be getting confused with making such an operation, and how even pointing out the problem would probably bring up a deeper discussion about some other changes that will need to be made to accommodate. But that is the life of box cutter. The hard decisions being made, so you don't have to, but just know that we're ever vigilant with keeping up with any bugs that occur and getting them sent to the proper channels to get them diagnosed and rectified in a rapid fashion. So here I am just cutting using mirror, and a custom cutter that I made without a whole lot of effort. Just had to turn off mirror in order to make my extraction. So, note to self, don't do cuts utilizing extractions. And we're still going through making these cuts, stacking them up over and over, utilizing the same custom cutter. But if you're an eagle-eyed viewer, you might notice that the booleans are beginning to get a little slower as we're stacking them up. And this is of course par for the course whenever it comes to box cutter, or basically any boolean tools. It's a limitation of course of Blender, so we are optimistic that in the future we'll be able to stack up more and more booleans of varying densities in order to make other ideas come to life. But for now, we are very grateful what we're receiving as it is. But my motto is always, of course, wanting more. So we want to change this to local because the orientation was just getting out of control. And we're just adjusting our extraction, and here we are looking at our object just goofing off with mirror. If we roll through the modifier scroll, we can actually see the chain of events that created this object, which can make for a really interesting result to show someone whenever you're working non-destructively, to just scroll through your modifiers and actually see the process that created it. In fact, you can see me creating the shape very, cursory with box, and then once it becomes a custom, things pick up very rapidly on this and we start jumping through it. So the next one I want to talk about is going to be, let's see, I believe that's it. We talked about array, solidify, bevel. Displace is actually associated with radial array, and taper is of course something you can set to be a start operation. To show taper in action, we'll set it to be persistent, and then we'll set it to 0.5, and let's actually jump to box. And now every box that I draw will always have a taper. And this can be good for things like working on normal maps or drawing cuts with intentions of baking them later. Sometimes you want it to actually reflect the details on the depth. And with standard box cutter depth, that sort of thing doesn't reflect. In fact, we look at this from top view and we can see all these varying levels of depth going down, just giving us a lot more richness than we would normally have ordinarily. So continuing on with box and just playing with taper, let's go ahead and turn persistent off and set this back to 1. And to show displace is one that we normally don't use. So I'm of the opinion that all of these options that are up to this point, and probably even displace, don't even need to be listed in here, but they're showing for technical reasons and because there's other things going on under the hood and for diagnostic purposes. But let's draw a box, and if we press V, we can array, and that's something we already talked about. But if we press V again, we'll jump into a radial array. And the radial array in box cutter is something that I feel could always use more work, and I do have plans on having it re-examined in the future. Also in the background you can hear Apple. We have Apple in the studio. But whenever it comes to using a radial array in box cutter, you can also press X to change the axis, which we see in this case doesn't have much of an effect. So what I'll do is actually draw this box again, shift it to live, and by shift right mouse clicking I can place my cursor here, and then by going in the Q menu of HardOps we can actually control click radial array and radial array around the 3D cursor, which is my preferred way of dealing with radial arrays. In fact, we could get rid of this and actually put our cursor in the center of this face using Shift S in edit mode, and if we were to just control click on radial array, we are able to rotate this to our liking. We could even press D to adjust the displace on something a little bit more acceptably. But just to show why displace is an option inside of box cutter, if we draw a box and we press V, we press tab, there's an additional dot that will allow you to adjust the displace distance of box cutter. However, I feel that there's always more work to be done with making this a little more streamlined, a little more organic, that there may be systems needed for us being able to rotate the shape inside of the bounds of the shape that we have, which is a little bit complicated to explain, but it's more like an edit mode of our edit mode. So whenever it comes to radial array inside box cutter, it's something that normally I just don't even deal with unless I'm dealing with a situation where I'm pretty much in control of my origin. For example, if we have our cylinder here, I can actually work off of this center face and then press VV in order to jump into radial array. And then by adjusting the dot, we can begin setting up a radial array. However, once you begin cutting, you are modifying the area that you're cutting, which also affects the origin. So here we are with a 2 in a row radial array, so far so good. Let's try that again. We're going to do another cut, maybe like so. We'll press B, but we'll press VV to radial array, and we'll bring it out. And here we are, 4 in a row so far, so good. Let's actually bring this out. We'll move it over and press 2 in order to mirror it on the Y. And then we'll press VV to radial array it, and we'll bring this in, and we see that the radial array has then broken down at this point, which is something that I personally can't live with. My goal is to always have the tools, be able to be consistent, continuously as you continue progressing in the workflow. So at this point, we have ran into a limitation of dealing with the center origin jump off point and using multiple modifiers inside the box cutter paradigm in order to make this work. However, all is not lost. Let's try this again. We'll draw this and we'll move it over and we'll press 2 in order to mirror it on the Y. And let's just set this up. Now we have our object. Let's snap our cursor to this location. It really doesn't matter that our cursor's here and not in the object center, because that also is acceptable. But just know that now we can go under mesh tools and just control click radial array and give it the proper amount of segments, and we're able to radial array this object. However, we do need to do something about some of these object origins. So something is right and something else is wrong. In fact, let's look at this from top view and just really try to get to the bottom of this. In fact, we're going to apply mirror and remove radial array displace, and we see that we've actually solved this problem. So now we're able to continuously keep working at this area. But now that we're bringing hops radial array into the mix, we can just press D, draw a box, press B to bevel, press T to solidify it, shift it to live, and then just control click radial array to radial array it around this object. In fact, I can see that the radial displace made it pop again. We'll just remove that as a modifier, but just showing you a little bit about radial array as a modifier inside of boxcutter and why we have it in addition to the other modifiers that are listed here, and why you'll never use displace. So continuing on, now we want to talk about orientation. So we talked about how generally whenever you begin drawing, you have your object oriented to the surface, which is calculated through something called object. We now have added subsystems to it, which will utilize either local, nearest edge, or longest edge. And the way that these can be a benefit is let's just grab an edge and just skew it. And if we try to draw a cut, this is what we're getting. And that's fine. You know, by now you should understand that we could be using line box to really lord this area, but instead let's actually change this to be nearest edge. And now we're able to work in this area and not have to change anything else or make any special accommodations. So this system is something of a life changer whenever it comes to dealing with boxcutter and managing your orientation, because trying to manage the 3D cursor and all that just didn't work out for us in the past, and it's something that we do plan to go back and revisit. However, at this time, we wanted something that was actually 100% capable of solving the situation. So we see that if I draw too far away from the nearest edge, the calculation will differ, causing me to need to draw the shape and transform it away from it and then bring it into the area I was trying to get to. So in a way, I'm almost trailblazing for the area that I'm going for. So now we want to change this to longest edge, and if we're lucky, we'll be able to draw oriented to that area. However, this time we'll need to offset it in order to adjust our draw dot and continue working at this arbitrary angle that we have set up. And the best part is that we can go over here and just begin drawing boxes, and they're automatically oriented to this area. So in a nutshell, that is utilizing the orientation system inside of boxcutter. Whenever you begin drawing, even if you're an object, if you're drawing with your cursor off of the mesh, what are we going to align it to is a deep philosophical question we ask ourselves. So the answer to that is actually align to view. If you draw starting off of the surface, you will align to view. However, what if you want to draw over the surface and still align to the view that you have currently set up? That's where align to view comes in. So by aligning to view, we're able to draw these cuts without having to take any regard to depth or anything like that. We're just drawing and clicking, and you can still draw and adjust your depth by just rotating your view. However, typically I use view align in conjunction with laser cut, which is just cutting with no depth on the object. So the next thing I want to talk about is, right now we're an object and we went over to view, which involved us bringing down this drop down. And going up to the top bar to access these things can be a lot of work. So for that reason, we've added Shift V inside of boxcutter. But even more importantly, there's a quick toggle next to object that will allow you to basically toggle align to view as is needed. So if you just need a quick toggle to jump to align to view, that is precisely what this is for. We had it in the past and then we removed it, and users expressed that they did miss it and did enjoy it, so now we have added it back.